No one noticed at first. That was the thing that would hollow Sandra Marsh out for years afterward, not the mystery itself, but how long it took anyone to see it. How a child can vanish in plain sight. How a family can sit around the same dinner table every night and never once ask the right question. His name was Eli. Eli Marsh, 12 years old, with a backpack that was always a little too heavy and eyes that were always a little too far away. He had a way of standing in doorways half in, half out, like he was never quite sure whether he belonged in the room. His mother called it hovering. His father called it daydreaming. His older sister Maya just called it being Eli. And for a long time, that was enough of an explanation for everyone. But something had been building inside that quiet boy for months. Something that nobody in the Marsh household had been paying close enough attention to see. And on a Wednesday afternoon in March, it finally broke the surface. Not in the way anyone expected. The school Eli attended was called Ridgeview Middle, a tan brick building on the edge of Clemens, North Carolina. He'd been going there since September. 7 months of ordinary mornings, ordinary packed lunches, ordinary goodbyes at the front door. And then one Wednesday afternoon, Eli didn't come home. Not gone. Not missing. Not taken. He simply didn't come home. He took a different route, a longer one, through the thin strip of woods behind Ridgeview's back field, and out to a place no one in his family even knew existed. He did it quietly, deliberately, the way you only do something when you've been planning it for a long time. His mother, Sandra Marsh, didn't panic at first. She assumed he'd stopped at Tyler's house, his best friend from elementary school. She tried the number. Tyler's mom said she hadn't seen Eli in weeks. Sandra tried 3 more numbers, nothing. By 5 o'clock, the panic was starting to build in her chest like water behind a dam. She called her husband. Robert Marsh was still at the office, something that had been happening a lot lately. He answered on the first ring, which meant he'd been watching his phone. She told him Eli wasn't home. He said, "I'm coming," and she didn't argue, because the truth was they both needed to be doing something, and sitting in separate locations doing nothing was a particular form of torment. By 6:23 p.m., Eli Marsh came home. He came up the front walk with his backpack slung over one shoulder, his jacket unzipped despite the cold, and a look on his face that Sandra would spend years trying to accurately describe. It wasn't guilt, exactly. It wasn't fear. It was something older looking than both, a careful composure, the expression of someone who has rehearsed their entrance. She grabbed his shoulders. "Where were you?" "It's past 6, Eli. I've been calling everyone." He held her gaze steadily. "I was at the library. My phone died." She looked at his eyes. She looked at his jacket, slightly muddy at the left sleeve, at the backpack, which seemed heavier than it should be. She noted these things and did not yet understand them. "The library closes at 6, she said. "I know," he said. "I left at 6. A tiny pause. I walked slow. She held him there another moment. Then she pulled him into a hug, and he let her, with the patient endurance of a boy who understood this was necessary. She released him. "Go wash up." He nodded and went upstairs, and Sandra stood in the entryway with a feeling she couldn't name. Not relief, not quite. Something older and less resolved. Something she had been avoiding for a long time. That night at dinner, the conversation was the kind that happens when a family is carefully not discussing what they should be discussing. Robert asked about Ellie's history test. Maya talked about her chemistry project. Sandra watched her son eat. She watched the way he handled his spoon, the way he occasionally looked up at her with those watchful eyes. He looked tired, not the good tired of a long day, the compressed tired of someone who has been carrying something they haven't been able to put down. She told herself she'd talk to him tomorrow. She did the dishes instead, and Eli went upstairs, closed his door, sat on the floor with his back against his bed, and thought about tomorrow, about going back. To understand where he was going and why, you have to go back. Back to September, when the school year started. Back to the morning a quiet boy read a poem aloud in a classroom and experienced, briefly and completely, the feeling of being entirely himself, and then had that feeling destroyed in 4 words. Ridgeview Middle School was by any measure unremarkable. 847 students. a gymnasium that smelled of old rubber, a cafeteria that served acceptable pizza on Fridays. Eli had started 7th grade the way he'd started every school year, by understanding the landscape before he entered it. He'd memorized the building map, researched the teachers, read the student handbook twice. This wasn't anxiety, exactly. It was the productive kind. The kind that converts nervousness into preparation. His first month was fine. He liked his math teacher, Miss Tran, who wrote equations with the focused energy of someone who genuinely loved what she was doing. Lunch was with Tyler Goodwin and a loose group of boys from elementary school, who were all becoming different people and weren't sure yet whether to bring each other along. He had not yet noticed Garrett Cole. Garrett had come from a different elementary school, and he arrived in 7th grade carrying none of the relational history that anchored everyone else. He was new, but he didn't behave like someone who was new. He behaved like someone who understood that the first weeks of middle school were a period of formation, a brief window where the hierarchies of 6 previous years dissolved and rebuilt from scratch, and who had arrived with a clear intention of ending up at the top of whatever structure emerged. He wasn't large, he wasn't loud. He had the loose, easy coordination of boys who've spent a lot of time around other boys, and brown eyes that were, depending on the moment, either warm or completely flat, with no visible transition between the two states. By October, he was sitting at the center table in the cafeteria, not through fighting or spectacle. He had simply moved there, as though it had always been his destination, and nobody had thought to question it. What Garrett was also very good at, and this was the part that took Eli longer to understand, was identifying threat. Not physical threat, social threat. The kind that came from people who were different enough, interesting enough, gifted enough to represent a form of contrast that was inconvenient to him. The poem was called November Light. Eli had written it for Ms. Hargrave's language arts class, a free verse piece about his grandfather, who had died the previous spring, and about November afternoons that always made him think of the old man's kitchen, and about the way grief wasn't sharp but diffuse, the way it spread through ordinary things and made them luminous and sad at the same time. He hadn't wanted to read it aloud. Ms. Hargrove called on him anyway, with the gentle authority of a teacher who recognizes when a student has produced something worth sharing. He walked to the front with the specific dread of a private person being made temporarily public, and read the poem in a careful monotone. And then something happened. The room went still, not the performative stillness of kids trying to appear attentive, the real kind. The kind that happens when a room full of people encounters something that speaks to them, from below the level where they normally operate. Ms. Hargrove asked him to read it again. He read it again, and this time he let his voice carry what was in the words, because the stillness had told him it was safe. For 30 seconds, Eli Marsh felt completely and fully seen. He walked back to his seat feeling lighter than he'd felt in months. Garrett was leaning against the lockers when they filed out. He was standing with 2 boys, and as Eli passed, he said, perfectly pitched, quiet enough that only the 3 of them could hear, "Nice poem, little baby." For words. Eli kept walking. His face stayed neutral. His pace didn't change. He turned the corner and went to his next class and sat down and stared at a blank page for 20 minutes while the lesson happened somewhere at a great distance. Here is the thing about for words. The thing that adults consistently fail to understand when children try to describe what is happening to them in middle school. The words themselves are almost never the point. The point is what they reveal. Those 4 words told Eli everything he needed to know about his situation, that someone had identified him as a target and had chosen the thing that made him feel most like himself as the weapon. He thought about telling Tyler. He got as far as forming the sentence before he noticed Tyler looking across the cafeteria toward Garrett's table with the slightly dazzled attention of someone beginning to understand where the power in the room actually lived. Eli swallowed the sentence and talked about something else. November proceeded. Garrett's campaign, and that was the right word, was invisible to adults and all too visible to Eli. It operated through small gestures, strategic exclusions, comments delivered just below the threshold of reportability, a look exchanged between 2 people in front of a third, the systematic erosion of a person standing through tiny, deniable increments. By December, Eli had rebuilt his entire daily routine around the problem. He arrived 8 minutes early. He took longer routes between classes. He had stopped volunteering answers in language arts because being visibly right in that room felt like painting a target on himself. He had also, quietly, stopped eating lunch with Tyler. Tyler had been orbiting Garrett's center table, not sitting there, not yet, but gravitating toward it, finding reasons to stand nearby. Eli watched this without resentment and with the sad precision of someone who can see the direction of things. He understood how it worked. He understood that most reasonable, decent people navigated toward shelter rather than stand in the rain on principle. What he couldn't do was tell his parents, because at home, something else was happening. Robert Marsh had made a business decision in late July when he hadn't told Sandra about fully, which was unprecedented in 16 years of marriage. He had redirected a significant portion of the firm's reserve capital into an investment that a client had called conservative and well-structured. It was neither. By September, the situation was serious. By November, he had retained a lawyer and was working with the bank and spending every moment not consumed by professional crisis management in the particular interior silence of a man who is desperately trying not to become the story of someone who loses what he spent 20 years building. He told Sandra some of it. The broad shape, a difficult situation, more careful with money for a while. He was handling it. What he didn't tell her were the specific numbers, the word liability, or the mornings he sat in the car in his own parking lot for 10 minutes before he could make himself go inside. Sandra knew something was wrong. She was perceptive enough to feel the shape of it even without the details. But she was operating in the space he'd provided, trusting him to handle it, managing her own anxiety through activity, running the household with meticulous efficiency, and going to bed every night, exhausted enough to sleep before she could think too hard about what lived underneath. Eli watched all of it. He watched his father come home and look at his phone before he looked at his family. He watched his mother's deliberate cheerfulness, the way she managed the household's emotional temperature like a musician managing dynamics, always adjusting, always compensating. He watched Maya perform obliviousness with the pragmatic efficiency of a 15-year-old who had decided that not knowing was more comfortable than knowing, and he absorbed it all into the weight he was already carrying. The combined load was something he bore alone, because there was no version of telling his parents that didn't mean adding to what they were already holding. He was 12. He understood, with the precise emotional mathematics of a sensitive child in a stressed household, that his problems were smaller than theirs, that the right thing, the good child thing, was to not add to the load, to be fine, to perform fineness convincingly enough that nobody had to worry. He was very good at it. That was the problem, because the thing about performing fine when you are not fine is that it is profoundly lonely. The performance requires you to be always slightly outside your own experience, always the observer, never the participant. And over time, the distance between the performance and the reality it's covering becomes a kind of chasm. You stand on one side of it looking at the actual shape of your life, and it is further away than it should be. By January, Eli was very far from himself. And then, by accident, he found the greenhouse. It happened on a Thursday in late January. He was walking home on the regular route when he turned a corner and saw Garrett and 2 other boys sitting on the wall in front of the laundromat, directly in his path. 3 seconds before they would look up and see him, he turned, not running, just turned, the way water redirects, smoothly and completely. He walked down a side street he'd never taken, found a gap in a chain-link fence behind a tool rental place, followed a barely visible path through a strip of overgrown woodland, behind Ridgeview's back field, and kept walking, past the turning that led to the Dairy Queen, into the quieter, less traveled section, into the part of the trees that felt, for the first time in months, like it wasn't watching him. He almost missed it. The greenhouse was screened by a stand of forsythia grown wild and high as a man's shoulder. Through the branches, a glint of light off glass. He pushed through the forsythia into a small clearing and stood at the door. He stood there a long time before he opened it. The door was wooden, with glass panels, one replaced by thick plastic sheeting, an old brass lever handle. I asked for a padlock, but the padlock was long gone. He pushed the door open. The smell hit him first. The complex, layered, intensely organic smell of a space that has been containing and composting and quietly growing things for decades, damp soil, water, the sweet rot of decomposed plant matter, and underneath all of it, the sharp, green smell of the few things still alive. It was nothing like the managed smell of parks or gardens. It was older than that, more complicated, the smell of life happening in the absence of anyone watching. He stepped inside. The greenhouse was roughly 15 by 20 feet, with a ridged glass roof that scattered the winter light into something soft and even. Long wooden tables ran down either side, mostly empty now, holding the brittle skeletons of long dead plants in cracked clay pots. A single water spigot on the north wall, a concrete floor with drainage channels, and at the far end, against the south-facing glass wall, something was growing. It had colonized about 4 feet of concrete floor from a crack between two slabs. Broad, waxy leaves, a thick central stem, the quality of something that had been waiting, with infinite patience, for someone to arrive. He sat down on an overturned crate and looked at it. He looked at the cracked glass ceiling, at the pale January sky visible through the panes. A crow landed on the ridge of the roof, studied him for a moment, and flew away. Eli Marsh sat in that greenhouse for an hour and 15 minutes and did not do anything at all. He didn't read or write or think in any productive sense. He just sat in the silence, the specific quality of silence that belongs to enclosed spaces that have been left alone for a long time, and let himself exist in a place where no performance was required, where no one needed him to be fine. For the first time in months, he did not feel alone. He came back the next day. This time he brought his notebook. He sat at the table and wrote for 45 minutes without stopping. Not homework, not anything structured. Just the truth, accumulated on the page in layers, according to the weight of what needed to come out first. He wrote about Garrett. He wrote about Tyler. He wrote about his father's face at dinner. He wrote about his grandfather and the poem and the 4 words and the feeling of standing at the front of Ms. Hargreaves' class when the room went still, and then what followed that feeling, and what it had cost him. He stopped writing and looked at the plant at the end of the greenhouse. He went to it and crouched in front of it and studied it the way you study something when you genuinely want to understand it. Its leaves had a translucent quality at the edges in the weak January light, as though the light was getting inside them, as though they were somehow more alive than things had any right to be in January. In an abandoned space, with no one looking after them, he photographed it from 3 angles. He looked it up that night, cross-referencing the leaf shape, the stem structure, the growth pattern. He read for 2 hours. He learned its name, Monstera deliciosa, a Swiss cheese plant, specifically a variety that had likely been intentionally planted years ago by whoever last maintained the greenhouse and which had, in the complete absence of anyone tending or restraining it, simply continued doing what Monstera deliciosus do when left alone, growing with the patient, unargumentative persistence of something that has decided it has a right to exist. He read about the holes in its leaves, the fenestrations, the detail that gave it its common name. They weren't damage, they were adaptation, a structural feature that developed as the plant matured, allowing the leaves to catch maximum light without being destroyed by wind. The appearance of something broken was actually a form of perfect design. He wrote about this in his notebook that night, to pages, beginning as a description of plant biology and ending in territory he didn't yet have clean language for, something about the difference between the appearance of damage and the reality of it, about the various ways a thing can be mistaken for one thing while being something else entirely. The following Monday he went to the public library and spent his free period looking up everything he could find about greenhouse cultivation, soil pH, germination times, and plant propagation. He checked out a book called The Complete Guide to Kitchen Gardening and read the first 60 pages that evening in the space of time he usually spent on homework at half efficiency. He was not distracted by the gardening book. He read with the focused absorption of someone encountering, for the first time, a subject that happens to be exactly the right shape for their mind. He started with seeds, basil, spinach, a variety of lettuce called black-seeded Simpson that the book recommended for beginners and which had the additional appeal of sounding like a person. He prepared the seed trays with the attention of someone who understood that beginnings were important, that the first 2 inches of soil were the whole story, really, that everything else was just the continuation of decisions made at the start. He came every day. After school, 90 minutes, on average. He developed a routine, checked the temperature inside using an old thermometer he'd found in a drawer under the main table, water the seedlings, record his observations in the notebook, then spend the remaining time working on the garden or reading from whatever library book he'd brought. He had also begun doing something else, something that would turn out to matter even more than the plants. He had begun talking to the monstera, not the way people perform warmth for an audience, earnestly. The way you explain something to someone who matters. He would crouch in front of it and tell it what he'd been thinking about. He would describe his day, what Garrett had done, what hadn't been said at dinner, the specific mechanism of the pressure he was living under. He told it things he hadn't told anyone, things he hadn't been able to access in any other context, because the truth about how he felt had been buried under so many layers of performed fine that he'd almost lost the root to it. He knew it was a plant. He was 12, not 6. He understood the fundamental situation, but there was something in the act of speaking the truth aloud, even to something that could not hear it, that loosened something in him. The truth had weight. Speaking it moved the weight. It was that simple and that important, and the kind of thing he couldn't explain to anyone in his life, because explaining it would require also explaining why he needed it, and that would open a door he had been keeping very carefully closed. In the 6th week, he planted tomatoes. He mixed the soil according to the book's formula. He arranged the seedlings in a long clay window box he'd found and repaired with waterproof epoxy. He composted in the corner from kitchen scraps he'd been collecting in his room in a container. He told his mother it was for a science project. She had not asked what the science project was. He noted this with complicated feelings, the relief of not having to explain, and underneath the relief, something lonelier, the feeling that perhaps she should have asked. He planted the tomatoes and watered them and stepped back and looked at the whole greenhouse, the green rows of basil and spinach, the lettuce in its trays, the monstera filling its corner like a declaration, the notebook open on the table to a page of his own handwriting recording soil temperatures and germination times and observations about light quality, and he felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt like himself, not the performance version, not the carefully assembled, not adding to anyone's problems version, the actual one, the one who liked growing things and reading about growing things, and the smell of soil, and the specific satisfaction of watching a seedling push its first 2 leaves to the surface of the earth as if it had been rehearsing that moment for its entire invisible underground life. He was in this state, calm, grounded, deeply present, when he heard footsteps outside the greenhouse. He went still the way prey goes still, completely, instantly, to sets of footsteps, moving through the forsythia with the careless crashing of people who don't know anyone is nearby. He could see the figures through the algae-clouded glass, slightly blurred, perhaps 20 feet away on the path. He recognized one of the voices, Garrett. He didn't make out the words. He stood completely motionless in the middle of his greenhouse and listened until the footsteps passed, until the forsythia stopped moving, until the clearing returned to silence. Then he let out the breath he'd been holding in a slow, controlled stream. Garrett didn't know this place was here. He was just cutting through the woods on the way somewhere, the Dairy Queen, probably, with no awareness of the greenhouse 30 feet from where he'd walked, no awareness at all. And this, Eli realized, was the specific quality of the greenhouse that he valued most. Not the garden, not the privacy, not even the freedom to be himself without performance. It was that Garrett couldn't reach him here. That was the actual architecture of what he was building. He had constructed, in the only way available to him, with the resources he had, a space that Garrett's cruelty had no access to, a space where what Garrett had said and done and continued to do, day after day in the hallways of Ridgeview, simply did not apply, where he was not a target or a social liability or someone whose poem had been used as ammunition. He was a gardener. That was all. And a gardener in a greenhouse is exactly where they are supposed to be. The Wednesday Eli came home at 6:23 was a Wednesday that had started differently from the others. That morning he had woken up to a text from Tyler Goodwin, sent the previous night at 11:43 p.m. It said, "Hey man, I heard what Garrett said to you today in the hall. That was messed up. I should have said something. Sorry I didn't." Eli read it 3 times, put his phone face down, got dressed, went to breakfast without replying. He was glad Tyler had noticed. He believed the apology was sincere, but something in the message also made him feel a particular quality of sadness that was separate from and harder to manage than the straightforward sadness of what Garrett had done. The sadness was about the distance, about the fact that Tyler had watched this for weeks, months, and had said something at 11:43 p.m. in a text after the fact when Eli was already asleep. It was the kind of sincerity that costs the person very little because it requires nothing going forward. The confession that substitutes for the action. He went to school and had an ordinary morning. In language arts, Garrett arranged himself and to friends in the hallway outside the classroom so that when Eli exited he had to navigate through them. One of them, not Garrett, let his shoulder connect with Ellie's as he passed, hard enough to spin him slightly, soft enough to deny it was intentional. The 3 of them moved on without looking back. It was nothing. It was also everything. The daily confirmation that the arrangement was still in place. That afternoon, Eli went to the greenhouse, and he was standing at the tomato box with his hands in the soil checking the moisture level when he heard the door behind him and turned. No, that didn't happen. What actually happened was quieter and more dangerous. He heard nothing. He was in the greenhouse with his notebook open and the space heater running, and his phone was in his bag with the ringer turned down, because he always turned it down in the greenhouse, and he didn't see his mother's first call at 4:47 p.m. or the call at 5:15, or the 4 messages that followed, the last of which said in capital letters, "Eli, where are you? Call me now." At 6:13 he looked up at the glass and noticed how dark it had gotten outside. He reached for his phone and felt the notifications arrive in a cascade, 7 of them, and then his mother's voice on voicemail saying his name in a way he had not heard since he was 8 and put his chin into the asphalt falling off his bike. He packed up in 6 minutes, moving with the guilty efficiency of someone who understands exactly how badly they've miscalculated. He covered the seedlings, turned off the heater, latched the door, moved through the forsythia at a pace that was not quite running and also not walking. He got home at 6:23. He said he'd been at the library. He looked at his mother's face when he said it and felt the specific vertigo of lying to someone who loves you. The way the lie creates a distance that wasn't there a moment ago, infinitesimal but real. The first brick in a wall you're building whether you intended to or not. He went upstairs, sat on his floor, thought about tomorrow. Over the following 2 weeks, Eli refined his system. He left the greenhouse by 4:30. He texted his mother at 3:45 from the school gate, heading home, before turning left toward the cut. He was methodical. He was, as he'd been about everything difficult this year, expertly managed in his concealment. Sandra felt something. She felt it without being able to locate it, the way you feel a low frequency, through the soles of your feet rather than your ears. She felt it in the evenings when Eli was occasionally somewhere else. Even while he was sitting at the table, she felt it in his backpack, which always seemed heavier than it should. She felt it in his hands, which were developing, incrementally. The slightly roughened texture of someone who handles soil regularly. She noted these things. She did not yet assemble them. She was a woman in the middle of her own crisis, financial, marital, the kind that lives in the gap between 2 people who love each other and are discovering that love is not sufficient protection against certain kinds of pain. Her reserves for fine-grained maternal observation were running lower than she wanted to admit. Then, in the 6th week, Eli did something that opened a crack in everything. He brought home the basil. He'd harvested it on a Thursday, the first harvest, which he stood looking at before he cut it, because the moment felt ceremonially significant. He cut the stems just above the second set of leaves, the way that encourages bushier regrowth. He held the small bunch up to the greenhouse light, and the smell of it, clean and sharp and alive, made his eyes sting in a way that was not entirely about the volatile oils. He put it in his backpack. He told himself he'd leave it on the kitchen counter. But Sandra was there when he came in, and before he could think about it, he was holding the bag out to her. She opened it. The smell hit her immediately, concentrated, summery, the kind that constitutes a very convincing argument for the existence of good things. She looked at the leaves, then looked at him. Where did you grow this? This was the moment. He could feel it the way you feel a threshold, the specific quality of a choice that has weight, that goes somewhere real. He could tell her everything. The greenhouse, the monstera, the 6 weeks, the notebooks, the real reason he'd been late that Wednesday. He could tell her about Garrett and Tyler and the 4 words in October and what it had cost him to carry all of it alone. He looked at her face. She was paying attention, really paying attention, in a way that had been rare this year. The daily machinery had stopped, briefly, and she was present in this specific room with this specific person in front of her. He said, at school, we're doing a gardening unit in science. The expression on her face shifted. He watched her decide whether to push. He watched her decide not to. She said, it smells incredible. Thank you, baby. She kissed the side of his head and went back to the counter. He went upstairs. He sat on the floor and understood, with a clarity that felt like settling rather than rising, that he had just used one of his chances, that the window she'd opened in the kitchen had closed, and that the next time it opened, he would need to walk through it. He picked up his notebook and wrote for 40 minutes about why he hadn't. He wrote about his father and the unspoken thing in the house. He wrote about Tyler's text and what it made him feel. He wrote about the shoulder in the hallway. He wrote about the monstera growing from a crack in the floor of an abandoned greenhouse, growing toward the available light with no acknowledgement of the circumstances that had put it there. He wrote, I think I'm going to have to tell someone. I think I've been waiting for things to be simpler before I tell someone. I think things might not get simpler. I think simpler might not be the bar I should be using. He read that back. He underlined the last sentence. He had made a decision about next week. What happened next week was not what he planned. It was a Monday in late February, and Eli was sitting in Mr. Borofsky's science class, filling in a worksheet about photosynthesis, a topic he now knew considerably more about than the worksheet required, when he felt something hit the back of his neck. A folded piece of paper, hard flicked. He reached down and picked it up without turning around. He already knew who was sitting to seats behind him and 1 row to the left. He unfolded the note under the table. It said, Hey poet, nice plants. He read it twice. Then he folded it into its square and put it in his jacket pocket, and spent the remaining 20 minutes of class working through a sensation in his chest that he would later identify as a very specific kind of fear, not the immediate fear of something about to happen, but the anticipatory fear of a thing already set in motion, whose full shape was not yet visible. Nice plants. Garrett knew about the plants, or knew something, enough to make the reference with the casual certainty of someone who has information. He thought about the footsteps in the forsythia, the 2 silhouetted figures through the algae-hazed glass. He thought about whether Garrett, cutting through the cut on his way to somewhere, might have stopped, might have looked, might have seen, through the clouded glass, the shape of a person inside a greenhouse that wasn't supposed to have anyone in it. He thought about how much that changed. He went to the greenhouse after school that day anyway. He stood at the door for a long moment before he opened it. He looked at what he'd built, the green rose, the tomato box, the notebook on the table, the monstera in its corner like something waving, and he thought about what it would mean if Garrett found this place, what Garrett would make of it, what instrument this place could become in the wrong hands. He sat on his crate. He looked at the greenhouse, and he made a decision that was different from the one he'd been approaching for weeks, more urgent, less careful. He thought about the note. He thought about the threshold. He thought about the window his mother had opened in the kitchen when he held out the basil, and how he'd let it close. He thought about the monstera, growing from a crack in the floor, growing toward the available light with no apology for the circumstances that put it there. He thought about his father on the back porch, That evening at dinner he looked at his father, at the face he loved, the face of a man he admired and was frightened for in a way that had no clean outlet. And when the meal was winding down, he said, "Dad, can we talk after dinner?" Robert looked at him. Something moved in his expression. He said, "Sure, Bud. Of course." The back porch was where the Marsh men went for conversations that needed a different kind of space, outdoors, slightly separated from the house's frequencies. They sat in the to-camp chairs in the early spring dark, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Eli said, "There's something going on at school that I need to tell you about." Robert waited. "And there's something else. Something I've been doing. They're connected, I think. I didn't see how connected until this week." Robert said, "Okay." The right kind of quiet. The kind that doesn't fill up the space, but leaves room for what needs to come. And Eli talked. He talked for 40 minutes. He told his father about Garrett, not in generalities but in specifics. The poem in October, the 4 words, the shoulder in the hallway, the note in science class today. He described the mechanism precisely, the way the campaign worked, its invisibility, its deniability, the way it had taken months before he understood its full shape. He described Tyler, the 11:43 p.m. text. His complicated feelings about it, not just the simple relief, but the thing underneath the relief, the loneliness of being let down slowly by someone you trusted. He described what it had been like to carry all of it alone. And then he told his father why he'd carried it alone, the thing in the house that nobody was talking about, the pressure he felt pressing down through the floors and ceilings, the mathematical calculation he'd made every morning about whose load was bigger and whether he was allowed to add to it. And then he told his father about the greenhouse. He told it from the beginning, from the turn at the laundromat, through the gap in the fence, down the path, through the forsythia. He described it the way he described things in his notebook, with the specificity of someone who has been paying full attention. The monstera, the water spigot, the thermometer, the space heater, from the thrift store, the seeds and the soil and the pH testing, the basil he had given to Sandra, which had come from there, the 6 weeks of arriving every afternoon and tending the thing he'd built, and speaking the truth to a plant because it was the only place he'd been able to speak the truth at all. He said, "I know it's a plant. I know it can't hear me, but it was the only place I didn't have to be fine. And I don't know why it worked there and not anywhere else, except maybe because there was no one there who needed me to be fine." Robert was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I owe you an apology, Eli." Eli waited. "I've been managing this year, managing what was wrong at work, managing what you and your sister and your mother were allowed to feel, by controlling what you were allowed to know." He paused. "I thought I was protecting you. What I actually did was bring it into the house anyway and make it invisible. And invisible things," Eli said, quietly, "still have weight." Robert looked at his son with an expression that wasn't quite crying, but was related to it. Something given up rather than broken down. "Yeah," he said, "they do." He told Eli that night on the back porch in the early spring dark, the real version of what had been happening with the firm. Not the managed version, the actual one. The decision in July, the investment that went wrong, the lawyer and the bank, and the months of working through it with the specific terror of someone who doesn't know if the thing they built is going to survive. Eli listened to all of it with the full depth attention that was his best and most underused quality. Then he said, "Is it going to be okay?" Robert was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with the honesty of someone who has finally stopped managing, "I don't know yet. It might be. I'm working hard to make it be. But I don't know for certain." Eli held this. He sat with it in the way the greenhouse had been teaching him to sit with things, present, undefended, not trying to resolve it into something more comfortable. Then he said, "I think you should tell Mom." Robert looked at him. "The real version," Eli said. A long silence. The neighborhood sounds. A dog, 2 streets over. The bass line of a car on Meridian. Robert said, "You're right." He sounded like someone putting something down that he'd been carrying for a very long time. The following morning, Sandra made Robert sit at the table before he left. Maya was already gone. Eli was upstairs. He could hear his parents' voices through the ceiling, not the words, only the rhythm of them. His mother asking things, his father answering in the careful pace of someone speaking without the usual management. A long silence, then both voices, quieter and a different quality of silence after that. The kind that contains two people making a decision together in the privacy of their own difficulty. Eli came downstairs. His parents were at the table, hands around coffee cups. His mother's face was complicated, open in a way it hadn't been in months, tired in a new way. And something else, something that took him a moment to name. She looked relieved. She reached out and squeezed his hand as he passed. He squeezed back. He went to the front door and took a breath and thought about all of it. The greenhouse, the monstera, the note in science class, the 40 minutes on the porch, and then he went to school. The meeting with Patricia Olmsted, the school counselor, happened on Thursday of that same week. Sandra had called on Wednesday morning and requested it with the quiet authority of a woman who had recently been given the full picture and had decided that managing it quietly was no longer on the table. Olmsted had 17 years of experience and a rubber plant in the corner of her office, and the particular quality of attention that marks the best counselors, not projecting, not anticipating, simply making itself available. She met with Sandra first, then she met with Eli. He sat across from her and told her everything. The same precision he'd used with his father, the specifics, the timeline, the mechanism. She listened and made careful notes and asked questions designed to clarify rather than redirect. When he described the note from Monday, she stopped writing for a moment. Then she asked him a question he hadn't anticipated. "Where have you been going after school?" He looked at her. She looked back with the neutrality of someone who has heard many things and is not going to be surprised. "There's a greenhouse," he said. He told her about it. He watched her face as he described the monstera growing from the crack in the concrete, and she paused in her note-taking. When he described talking to the plant, she set her pen down entirely. When he described the basil, the harvest, the smell of it, the decision to give it to his mother, she looked at him for a moment before writing anything. When he finished, she said, "I want to ask you something." "Why plants?" He thought about it. "Because plants don't care if you're doing it right. They just respond. You give them what they need. They grow. If they don't grow, it's because of something specific that you can figure out and fix. This year, everything at school and at home, I couldn't figure out what I was doing wrong, or whether I was doing anything wrong, or whether it was even about me. The plants were different. There's always a reason. The reason is knowable. When you know it, you can do something about it." Olmsted held his gaze. "That's a very articulate thing to say about a very difficult year." He said, "I wrote it in my notebook first. It's easier to say things after I've written them." She said, "I'd call that a skill worth keeping." He looked at her rubber plant in the corner. "That plant could use more light," he said. She looked at it. "I've had it 9 years and never thought about that. It'll tolerate low light, but it'd be happier over there." He nodded toward the window. She made a note on her pad. He couldn't read it from where he was sitting. The meeting produced several outcomes. It produced a formal intervention with Garrett and his parents scheduled for the following Tuesday. It produced a referral to a therapist outside school, a woman named Dr. Kelsey Park, whose office had a thriving fiddle leaf fig in the waiting room that Eli noted with appreciation. And it produced, in Sandra Marsh, a quality of awareness about her son's interior life that 7 months of proximity had failed to create. She went to the greenhouse on a Saturday morning, alone, without telling Eli. She followed his description of the route, down Meridian, left on Ridgeview, through the fence, down the path, through the forsythia. She found the door slightly ajar the way he'd said it usually was when he wasn't inside. She pushed it open. The smell hit her first. She had not been prepared for the scale of it. She had imagined something smaller, more improvised, more clearly the project of a child. What she saw was something organized, intentional, and alive in a way that stopped her in the doorway and kept her there, cataloging. The rows of seedling trays, the tomato box against the south wall, stems tied to bamboo stakes he'd found somewhere and repurposed, the compost corner, carefully layered, the thermometer on the north wall, the notebook, closed, on the end of the table, the space heater on the floor below the potting bench, and the monstera in the northwest corner. She went to it slowly, the way you approach something that has been described to you with reverence by someone you love. She crouched in front of it and looked at it for a long time. It was as large as he'd said, perhaps larger. Its leaves were catching the morning light in the way he'd described, the translucent quality at the edges, the light getting inside them. The fenestrations visible in the older leaves, each hole slightly different, the pattern never quite repeating. She put her hand on one of the large lower leaves. Cool, smooth, slightly waxy. The solid, unargumentative fact of it, growing from a crack in the concrete floor of an abandoned greenhouse in the woods behind her son's middle school. She sat down on the concrete floor in front of it. She thought about Eli talking to this plant every afternoon for 6 weeks. She thought about what he'd had to say here that couldn't be said anywhere else. She thought about all the things she now understood that she hadn't understood a week ago, and about the things she'd had access to, had been standing directly next to, and had failed to see. She thought about the basil, how it had smelled in the kitchen, how he had held it out to her, and she had taken it and not pushed when she should have, how the moment had passed the way moments always pass, quietly, without announcing itself, leaving only its absence behind. She sat on the concrete floor for a long time. Then she got up and looked around the greenhouse one last time, at all of it, the accumulated evidence of a 12-year-old building something beautiful in the absence of anyone watching, and she walked home and cried for the first time in 7 months. Not because something terrible had happened, because she finally understood the shape of the year they'd been living through, and because understanding it meant something could now change. The meeting with Garrett and his parents was on a Tuesday in Patricia Olmsted's office. Garrett's father, Kevin Cole, was a large, loud man sitting in the compressed stillness of someone actively containing something. His mother, Marlene, was quieter, carefully watchful, the way of someone practiced at managing the gap between what is and what is presented. When Olmsted described the specific incidents, Marlene made a small movement with her face, a tightening. It looked less like surprise than recognition. Garrett sat beside them looking at the table for most of the meeting. He was wearing a sweatshirt he'd had on at school before, hands in the front pocket, hood strings pulled uneven. He looked like what he was, a 13-year-old in a situation he hadn't expected to be in, the composure he carried at school thinned down to something less managed, more frightened. At the end of the meeting, Olmsted gave him the opportunity to speak. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I don't know why I did it." Olmsted waited. "I know the things I did," he said. "I know I did them." A pause. "I just don't know why." His father made a sound that was not quite a dismissal. His mother looked at her son with the specific expression of a mother recognizing something true about her child in a context she would have preferred not to be in. Olmsted looked at Eli. Eli was looking at Garrett. He was thinking about the monstera, about growing in the direction of available light, about the fenestrations, the holes that looked like damage from the outside and were actually the organism's answer to the specific physics of its environment. He was thinking about what kind of environment produced a person who had learned, very early, to read social power as a tool, and what that learning had cost. He was 12. He was not going to say any of this in the meeting, but he held it, and it changed something about the way he sat in the room. Slightly less like a victim, slightly more like someone who has been trying to understand a phenomenon, and has arrived at a partial theory. When Olmsted asked if he had anything to say, he said, "I just don't want it to happen anymore." Olmsted said, "That's what we're here to make sure of." Sandra drove him home in a silence that was the new kind, not managed, not full of unspoken things, but comfortable. The silence of two people who have recently been honest with each other and don't need to fill the space with performance. After a while he said, "Mom." She said, "Yeah, I want to show you the greenhouse." A pause. "I already went," she said. "Last Saturday." He looked at her. She kept her eyes on the road. "What did you think?" He said. "I sat on the floor in front of the monstera for about 20 minutes. He was quiet. She said, "I think you built something remarkable. I think it might be the most honest thing I've seen in a long time." He turned back to the window. The streets moving past, the gas station, the laundromat, the gap in the chain link fence briefly visible between the tool rental place and the plumbing supply store. He said, "It needs to be registered. The greenhouse. Someone owns the land." I looked it up. It's the town. There's a community garden petition process. Sandra said, "Interesting. Also, the roof has to cracked panels that are letting in moisture. If they're not repaired before summer, the temperature regulation becomes a problem." How much would the repairs cost? I found reclaimed glass panels on Craigslist. $40 each. But I'd need help with the installation. I can't hold the panels and fasten them at the same time. Sandra said, "I'll ask your father." Robert came on a Saturday morning with a thermos of coffee and a toolbox, following his son through the gap in the fence and down the path, with the slightly careful gait of a man navigating overgrown woodland in his weekend clothes. He stood in the greenhouse doorway and let the smell and the light and the scale of it settle over him. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "The tomatoes are looking good." They worked for 3 hours. Robert on the ladder, Eli below handing up tools and panels and calling observations about the fit and the angle, consulting printed instructions he'd annotated in the margins. The work had the quiet focus of a shared practical problem, the useful, unadorned communication of two people attending to a task that has its own logic and asks only for competence and attention. Partway through the second hour, Robert said from the top of the ladder, "You know what this reminds me of?" Eli said, "What?" "Your great-uncle Felix had a greenhouse behind his house in Raleigh. He grew orchids, hundreds of them." A pause as he fitted the glass into its frame. "My mother used to take me there when I was about your age." He said the point of orchids wasn't the flowers. The point was the patience, that they operated on their own schedule and no amount of wanting them to bloom faster made any difference. Eli thought about this. Then he said, "Tomatoes don't really require patience. They come up pretty fast." Robert laughed, the real kind, arriving without warning, leaving him looking slightly surprised by himself. "Start with tomatoes," he said. "Work up to orchids." At noon they stood side by side in the greenhouse, looking up at the repaired roof. The new panels sat clean and transparent in the frames, admitting light that was a full shade brighter than what they'd been getting through the cracked ones. Robert put his hand on Ellie's shoulder. A brief, solid pressure. He didn't say anything. Eli looked at the monstera. The clean noon light was falling on it now, a direct, unfiltered band striking its broad leaves and making them glow the specific deep green of things that are exactly where they're supposed to be. He said, "Hey, Dad." Robert said, "Yeah. Thank you for coming." Robert said, "Thank you for telling me." They stood there in the smell of damp earth and growing things and the quiet of the space, tended back to life from abandonment, father and son, in the particular quality of silence that belongs to two people who have recently told each other the truth and are now living in the space the truth creates, which is harder than the space that performance creates, and also, finally, real. Then Eli said, "I was thinking about planting peppers next." Robert said, "You'll need to check the soil requirements. Peppers are more demanding than tomatoes." Eli said, "I already did. I have notes." Robert said, "Of course you do." They left together through the forsythia, back down the path, through the gap in the fence, into the ordinary Saturday of the ordinary neighborhood, carrying between them a slightly different weight than the one they'd arrived with, not lighter, exactly, but distributed differently, held between two sets of hands rather than one, which is a different physics entirely. The months that followed didn't resolve into clean happiness, because life is not in the business of clean happiness, and because the Marsh family had too much reality in it by now for anyone to want the clean version over the real one. Robert's situation at the firm worked itself through the spring, not without cost, but toward stability. The word manageable replaced the word crisis. They sold the vacation house in the mountains. It hurt. They had the difficult conversations that had been waiting, the ones where one partner acknowledges a decision made without adequately consulting the other, where the other partner decides how much residual anger is useful and where the line is. They worked through it, slowly, imperfectly, in the way things that matter to people are usually worked out. Not in a single conversation, but in 100 small ones. Not by resolving the past, but by building a different kind of present. Sandra went back to the greenhouse twice more that spring. The second time she helped Eli build a compost system in the eastern corner, following a design he'd found in a sustainable gardening book. They worked in the comfortable silence of people who have recently learned how to be in the same space without filling it with anything other than what the task requires. After that visit, she called the City Parks and Recreation Department about formalizing use rights for the parcel. 3 weeks later, a woman named Claudia Hennessy came out from the Parks Department to look. She walked through the forsythia, stood in the clearing, went inside. She looked at the seedlings, the amended soil, the repaired glass panels, the monstera. She said, "This is formally maintained." Sandra said, "My son has been tending it since January." Claudia looked at the tomatoes, which were now past their first flowers and setting small, hard, green protofruits, with the determination of things that don't know they're not supposed to be growing this well. She said, "How old is your son?" Sandra said, 12. Claudia Hennessy made a sound that the municipal bureaucracy didn't usually produce. A simple recognition of a thing being done properly by someone whose age made it unexpected. She said, "I'll put in a recommendation for a community garden designation. It won't be fast, but it'll be legal, which means he can continue." On her way out, she said, "Tell your son the monstera could use fertilizer. It's been in that concrete for a long time. The soil's probably quite depleted." Sandra said, "I'll tell him. He'll know exactly what kind." Garrett Cole and Eli Marsh did not become friends. That would have required a different story, the kind where the victim carries the emotional labor of the reconciliation, which is a narrative convenience that doesn't reflect how these things actually work. What happened instead was quieter and more honest. They became people who existed in the same building without active hostility. Garrett completed his mandated counseling sessions with variable engagement, resistant at first, then less so, with the slow, uncertain quality of someone beginning to suspect that not doing the work has costs he hasn't been accounting for. By the end of the year, his cruelty was observably less precise, less convinced of its own rightness. Tyler Goodwin sent another text in April. This one said, "Hey, I know you haven't replied to my last one. I get it. I just wanted to say I'm sorry for real. Not the 11 p.m. text sorry. The actually meaning it sorry. And I miss hanging out with you sometimes." Eli held this for several days before he replied. Not from cruelty or strategy. From the natural result of sitting with something long enough to know what you actually think, rather than what you reflexively think. He replied on a Wednesday evening, "Hey, thanks. I think I know the difference. I miss it too sometimes. I'm going to be busy a lot of afternoons, but maybe one weekend we could hang out. I have something to show you." Tyler came to the greenhouse on a Saturday in May. He walked through the forsythia and stood in the doorway, and said ho with the specific register of a 12-year-old encountering something genuinely unexpected. They spent 2 hours there, and Eli showed him how to check soil moisture and identify aphid damage and what the pH testing strips meant. And Tyler paid attention with an engagement that was partly novelty and partly something more genuine, the specific engagement of someone discovering that a world they hadn't thought to look at has more in it than they expected. At one point, Tyler stood in front of the monstera and said, "What's this one?" Eli told him the name. He told him about the fenestrations. He told him the whole thing he'd worked out, how the holes weren't damage, they were adaptation. How what looked broken from the outside was the organism's solution to a problem the environment had posed. Tyler looked at the monstera for a while. He said, "Is that, like, a metaphor?" Eli said, "Probably." Tyler said, "For what?" Eli thought about it. Then he said, "I think for most things, actually, Dr. Kelsey Park, the therapist on Whitmore Street, had been seeing Eli weekly since April. She was 39. With a background in adolescent psychology and a particular interest in what she privately called the translation problem, the difficulty that sensitive, internally complex young people have converting their interior understanding of themselves into a form communicable to the people around them. She had seen this problem many times, in many variations, and the Eli Marsh version was unusual in one specific way. He had been doing, alone in a greenhouse, something that therapy is formally designed to facilitate. He had been speaking the truth of his experience to a presence that was not going to judge him for it. She was careful not to pathologize this. The greenhouse wasn't a symptom, it was a solution, and a sophisticated one. What she worked on with Eli, carefully and recursively, was not why he'd needed it, but how to translate what he'd learned there, the specific fluency with his own truth, into a form that worked in the other spaces of his life. By June, he was doing something in her office that he had not been able to do anywhere except the greenhouse, saying true things in real time without first writing them down to a person who was listening. This was not nothing. This was, in fact, everything. The last day of school came in the first week of June, a half day, releasing its students at noon into the first genuinely warm afternoon of the season, the kind where the heat is a pleasure, not yet an assault. Eli walked home the regular route, right on Meridian, not left, past the gas station, past the laundromat, no boys on the wall today, just a woman folding shirts through the window, and up the front path of 147 Meridian Street. He opened the door. He called out, "I'm home." Sandra was in the kitchen. She turned from the stovetop and looked at him, and they looked at each other the way they'd been looking at each other since March, differently from before March, with the specific attentiveness of people who have recently discovered that looking carefully was worth it. He said, "It was kind of okay. I'm glad it's over." She said, "Yeah." He said, "This year was really hard." She held his gaze. "I know. I'm sorry I didn't see more of it sooner." He said, "You were dealing with a lot." She said, "That's true. It's not an excuse." A quiet moment. Then she said, "Are you going to go to the greenhouse this afternoon?" He said yes. He had things to check, and he wanted to start mapping the summer planting layout. There was a lot more sun in summer, and he needed to think about temperature management. She said, "Can I come?" He looked at her. She said, "I'm asking. I know it's your space. I'd like to, if you want me to." He thought about it, the greenhouse in its clearing, the smell of it, the light through the glass, the monstera in its corner, the tomatoes blushing toward red on the vine, unhurried, operating on their own schedule. He thought about his father on the ladder and Tyler in the doorway, and Claudia Hennessy looking at the plants with municipal recognition. He said, "Yeah, come on." They left together, out the back door, down the alley, the long way to the cut. The neighborhood in early June was loud with color and full of itself, yards in full leaf, the first real warmth of the season lying across everything like a permission. Sandra walked beside her son with her hands in her pockets, and her face turned slightly toward the sky. He said, "The monstera is going to need repotting before fall. It's getting root-bound." She said, "What does that mean?" He said, "The pot's too small for how much it's grown. The roots have nowhere left to go." She said, "So it needs more room." He said, "The right amount. Not too small, not too big. Too much room and the water doesn't drain properly and the roots can rot. You have to get the ratio right." She looked at him sideways. He caught the look. "I'm not making a metaphor." She said, "I know." A pause. "It does work as one, though," he said. She laughed. He smiled, not the same thing as laughing, but the quieter, more private version. The kind that didn't need an audience. The kind that was entirely its own. They turned through the gap in the fence, down the path, through the forsythia, which had leafed out into a full wall of yellow-green. The clearing on the other side almost invisible until you pushed through. They pushed through. Together. The greenhouse stood in its clearing in the early June light, glass panels bright and clean. The new panels Robert had helped install distinguishable by their slightly higher transparency. The whole structure doing what it had been built to do, holding light and warmth and growing things against the ambient coldness of the world outside. Eli pushed open the door, and the smell came out to meet them, and they went inside. The monstera was there in its corner. The tomatoes were there, the first fruits blushing slowly toward red. The basil, the spinach, the succession lettuce Eli had planted to replace the bolted summer variety. The notebook on the table, closed, a pencil beside it. Months of honest thinking recorded in small, careful handwriting that said more about who Eli Marsh was than almost anything else about him. Sandra walked to the monstera and crouched in front of it, the way she'd crouched on the concrete floor 6 weeks ago alone. She looked at its leaves, the older ones with their fenestrations, each hole slightly different, the pattern never quite repeating, the appearance of damage that was actually something else, the organism's answer to the specific geometry of its situation. She put her hand on one of the large lower leaves. Cool, smooth, slightly waxy, solid with the specific gravity of something that has been growing for a long time, without apology. Eli was at the tomato box, checking soil moisture, making a note in the margin of his planting calendar, not looking at her, just doing what he came here to do, tending the thing that needed tending, paying attention to the thing that required attention, moving through the tasks of a space he had built and understood, and loved in the way that you love something you have chosen entirely on your own. Sandra looked at the monstera. She looked at her son. She thought about the year, about all the things she hadn't seen and all the things she'd seen too late and all the things that, because of being seen too late rather than not at all, had been repaired rather than lost. She thought about Robert at the kitchen table finally telling her the real version. She thought about the muffled voices through the ceiling that night, her son and his father on the back porch, saying the things that had needed to be said for a long time, in the only space that had felt safe enough to say them. She thought about the basil, how he had held it out to her, and how she had taken it, and how she had not pushed when she should have, and how the moment had passed. She was going to try to provide the room, the specific thing she hadn't been providing, not the material safety, not the logistics, not the performance of normality. The room, the kind of consistent, available, unhurried attention that simply says, there is space here. Whatever you're carrying, you can put it down, one small choice at a time. The way that soil improves, the way that plants grow. Eli finished his notes. He set down his pen and looked at the tomatoes. He said, about 2 weeks until they're ready. She said, what do we do with them? He said, I was thinking about making sauce. There's a recipe that uses fresh basil. A pause. We'd need more than this box. But if I start another one next week, she said, let's do it. He looked at her. She was still crouched by the monstera, one hand on its lower leaf, the June light through the glass, making both of them glow in the specific way that things glow when the light is exactly right. He said, do you like cooking? She said, I never thought about whether I liked it or whether I was just doing it. He thought about this. I think there's a difference. She said, I think you're right. They stayed in the greenhouse for 2 hours that afternoon. They weeded and watered, and Eli repotted his struggling basil, explaining as he transferred it why the root-to-soil ratio mattered and what the signs of stress looked like. Sandra held the new pot steady while he worked. A small thing, a 5-minute thing, but a collaboration, to people attending to the same task, each contributing what they had. The work going better for both of them being there. When they left, the June light was longer and lower, golden the way early summer evenings are when they're finally, actually warm. They walked back through the forsythia, Sandra first, holding the branches for Eli, and then the path, and then the gap in the fence, and then the neighborhood with its grilling smells, and its sprinklers and its children on bicycles, the ordinary percussion of an ordinary evening, which is also, if you've learned how to look, if a 12-year-old boy and an abandoned greenhouse and a plant growing from a crack in a concrete floor have taught you something about the difference between the surface and what lives beneath it. Something more. That evening the Marsh family ate dinner on the back porch. Robert had come home early for the first time in months. The fold-out table. Sandra's salad with basil from the second harvest, fuller, more fragrant than the first. The way things come back when they've been tended well. Maya appearing at the back door with the faint surprise of someone who finds family dinner. Outdoors sufficiently novel to interrupt her phone. They ate in the evening light. The conversation was ordinary. The ordinary of people who have recently decided to tell each other the truth and are now figuring out what ordinary sounds like in that new register. Imperfect, sometimes halting, full of imperfect people managing to be at the same table. Eli tasted the basil. He tasted it the way you taste something when you know where it came from. When it traveled from a crack in the ground in an abandoned greenhouse to this table, via the specific machinery of your own persistent, quiet, entirely your own labor. It tasted different that way. Not better, exactly, but more real. He thought about seeds, about what a seed requires. Light and water and soil and the patient, unhurried attention that doesn't rush the process, but simply makes itself available to it. He thought about the year, about what had been growing underground for a long time, in the dark, in the specific conditions of a difficult season, and that had finally pushed through the surface because someone, imperfectly, too late, in the complicated and irreversible way of real things, had begun to pay the right kind of attention. He looked at his father, who was telling Maya something about her summer plans with the patient humor of a man who has recently been reminded that patience is worth practicing. He looked at his mother, who was listening to Robert and also, in the corner of her attention, watching Eli with the quality of attention she had been building since March, the kind that doesn't require anything but is simply available. He thought about tomorrow, about the greenhouse, about the tomatoes nearly ready for harvest, about the monstera, which was going to need repotting in the fall, which was going to need someone to make the careful, specific decision about how much more room was right. Not too small, not too big, just enough more than what it had, just the right amount of space to grow without drowning. He thought about that. Then he passed the salad and said, "Dad, can I tell you about the pepper situation?" Robert said, "The pepper situation?" Eli said, "I've been reading about capsicum cultivation. I think I can make it work in the greenhouse, but I need to talk through the soil amendment strategy." Robert looked at him, then at Sandra. She was looking at her salad with a small, private smile that was not for anyone in particular, the smile of a woman who is in the middle of a life that is real and difficult and full of imperfect people who are, tonight, at the same table, in the evening light, talking about pepper cultivation. Robert said, "Tell me about the peppers." And Eli told him, and the evening held them in its ordinary light, in the backyard of 147 Meridian Street in Clemens, North Carolina, in the imperfect, real, irreplaceable manner of an ordinary evening in a life that has recently been reminded of what it is for. In the cut, 2 streets away, through the forsythia, the greenhouse stood in the last of the daylight. Its repaired panels caught the setting sun at an angle that turned the whole structure briefly. Brilliantly amber, lit from within by warm reflected light and the green life it contained. The monstera in its corner doing what it always did, growing, quietly, steadily in the direction of the available light, untroubled by the lateness of the hour or the season or the circumstances that had brought it to this particular crack in this particular floor, faithful only to the logic of its own life, which required nothing more complicated than what it had, light, dot, and water, and the patient, unhurried time to become what it was always going to become. The door was slightly ajar, the way Eli always left it, to let the air move, to let the space breathe, to keep the threshold between inside and outside open to whatever came through, waiting for him to come back, the way good places wait, the way true things wait, the way the most important things in a life always wait, without urgency, without demand, for the person who built them to return and find, each time, that the thing is still there, still growing, still true, still exactly what they needed it to be.